You want to know what I love more than anything? Good old-fashioned platformers. Platformers are the apple of my eye. They are that hot cup of joe that I need every morning to get me through the day. They are the oxygen I need to breathe into my lungs in order to not waste away into dust and particles. To put it as simply as possible for you, platformers are the bee's knees. Platformers to me represent gaming in its purest of pure forms. It's that simple concept of taking a guy that you're in control of and navigating him through obstacle courses of varying degrees of challenge and getting him to the end goalpost that to me captures the very essence of a video game without muddying things up with overly complicated game mechanics or cutscenes that try way too hard to come off like a movie. Take the original Super Mario Bros. For NES, for example. That game single-handedly revolutionized video games and planted the seed that would grow to become what games are now. And it was a straightforward, no-nonsense platformer. So I don't want to hear any arguments from y'all in the comments saying that platformers are a relic of the past that don't deserve any love, because if it wasn't for them, you likely wouldn't be able to enjoy the interactive movies, video games, that you enjoy today. It's just that simple. Y'all remember these guys? The year is 2017, and Yooka-Laylee, a 3D platformer acting as a spiritual successor to the classic series Banjo-Kazooie, was released by Play-tonic Games to a mixed reception. It took heavy inspiration from that classic collectathon formula from 3D games of old, and tried its diddly darn best to recapture the magic of those games in a modern context. What followed was a game that on its surface showed a lot of promise, but in practice felt middling and unrefined. It also didn't help that the titular characters, Yooka the Lizard and Laylee the Bat, felt unapologetically derivative of the original Bear and Bird characters, especially in terms of personality. I know that Play-tonic Games from the start made it very clear that their intention with this game was to act as a successor to Banjo-Kazooie, but I had no idea they would stick so close to the concept that their lead characters would be practically identical in every way to the original pairing minus their species. It's little choices like this that made it even harder for Yooka-Laylee to differentiate itself from the pack. And when you combine that with its equally derivative gameplay, Yooka-Laylee was almost destined to disappoint the masses. Fortunately, what followed that up, however, was something totally different. Something fans definitely were not expecting. It wasn't a 3D platformer this time, no. It was a 2D platformer, well, a 2.5D platformer if you take into account that the graphics are in 3D but the core gameplay is primarily side-scrolling. Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair was released in 2019 to near critical acclaim, and honestly, it's pretty easy to see why. The game felt fresh but familiar. The level design was top-notch. There were now tons of collectibles that were not only fun to search for, but satisfying to collect. There were plenty of secrets to discover. The music was absolutely legendary. What am I doing speaking on this game in the past tense? This game is only a few years old and honestly feels like a near revolution of the platforming genre as a whole. Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair is immaculate, and if you will have me, I'm going to show you why it's immaculate. But also, it's not perfect. When it comes to making a strong first impression on the player, sometimes it's better to cut the crap and jump right into the meat of things with your game. And considering how important it was for Impossible Lair in this instance to make that good impression, the cutting of the crap is exactly what transpired here. The game opens up with our titular heroes immediately being thrust into a brief yet chaotic tutorial level where we are reintroduced to the series' main antagonist, Capital B. Capital B has already taken over by this point, having kidnapped the entirety of the army of bees, the Bee-talion, that protect this land. And it's up to you to stop him. I really appreciate how little this tutorial section drags its feet. teaching you the basics in a swift manner while also building a frenetic pace by having the tutorial take place in the middle of a battle with the game's main antagonist. And if by this point the game somehow hasn't already sparked your attention, the following pro-developer move takes place where it literally has you fighting the final boss head-to-head in the game's opening minutes. If that isn't a good first impression to a game, then I will never know what is. To take it another step further, if you somehow manage to beat Capital B in the first phase of this fight, then you will be introduced to the Impossible Lair, an insanely challenging platforming gauntlet made up of 3 phases divvied up between 3 separate boss battles with Capital B, with each phase of each respective platforming and boss battle section getting progressively harder with each phase. Could you imagine being one of those guys who, having just learned the basic mechanics of this game, manages to beat Capital B in the first phase and then immediately finds himself having to face this ridiculous platforming gauntlet, all within the first 5 minutes? I mean, that guy definitely was not me, I'll tell you that much, because I got murked by Capital B, straight up. But hey, the way I see it, it's all uphill from here, baby. Following this battle, the player is introduced to the game's overworld, a beautiful, sprawling land where this game's various levels can be found scattered throughout. The gameplay while in the overworld changes to a 3D bird's eye view perspective, more closely resembling the playstyle of the original Yooka-Laylee, with the main difference coming from the camera floating above the player this time. It's here where the game primarily emphasizes exploring and puzzle solving over platforming, as well as a little world building. You'll meet various familiar characters from the previous game who will do their usual shtick, and you'll also see the more refined personalities of Yooka and Laylee shine through here. Yooka and Laylee are no longer just reskinned copies of Banjo and Kazooie, as their personalities are much more phoned in and well balanced. Unlike the previous game where it seemed like every time they opened their mouths, the devs would take the opportunity to slap you across the face repeatedly and remind you, hey, these two are literally Banjo and Kazooie, they're literally Banjo and Kazooie, these guys are literally Banjo and Kazooie, and we didn't bother tweaking their personalities to make them unique because we desperately needed to capitalize on nostalgia. I hated that about the last game. It was so grating hearing Laylee make some abrasive quip or some bad British pun every time she opened her mouth. And yeah, she did that every time she talked. I'm not kidding. Every time she spoke. Every single time she always had to make some pun or some jab at one of the characters or something like that, you know? Just like Kazooie from Banjo and Kazooie would do every single time. And not once did it ever make me think, oh wow, Laylee is such a funny character with attitude, I love her. No, it always just reminded me of Kazooie and how she would do that sort of thing. And I just couldn't unsee how unapologetically plagiaristic these characters clearly are. And it just took me out of the whole experience. Yooka and Laylee are no longer annoyingly samey to the bear and bird this time. And it's a small choice like that that helps make Impossible Lair feel more like its own thing. As previously mentioned, Impossible Lair's overworld emphasizes exploring and puzzle solving. Basically what you're exploring for are hidden passages, as well as hidden collectibles known as Play-tonics spread across the overworld. See what they did there? Huh? See, it's a play on words, you know, they did the play on words thing. It's, you know, Play-tonics are basically game modifiers you can equip during the game's main levels to either assist you or make things more difficult for you depending on which ones you choose. Play-tonics are often found cleverly hidden behind walled off areas that you either need to solve a puzzle or to do some basic platforming to get to. The puzzles this game has you solving to get to these secrets are, well, I mean, if I had to sum them up in a single word, it would be cute. None of them are going to have you scratching your noggin like Donkey Kong or traveling interstellar space to find the answers, but they do serve as a neat little way to make the overworld gameplay feel a bit more dynamic. After all, there's only so much you can do with the 3D bird's eye view situation we got going on here, especially when your character's jump height is borderline pathetic, and he also happens to move at the pace of a Goomba. So having the puzzles here at least adds variety to the gameplay, and overall helps make the overworld feel like a nice little break from the main platforming action. Although admittedly some of these puzzles do end up being a bit more involved than I personally was welcome to. Especially the ones that have you doing a lot of platforming to solve. Those ones just flat out suck. Yuka's jump height is already abysmal in the overworld, so throwing the player into countless situations where you have to jump across gaps to get to something is crazy. Play-tonic really had no business making Yuka's jump height this pathetic in the overworld. I mean, god, just look at this. Look at this little hop that he does. It's awful. If you're gonna have me doing lots of platforming in your overworld like you do in your game's main levels, that you better at least give me a decent jump height. The amount of times I found myself failing at a platforming section because of the crappy jump is far more than any player should have to deal with, especially considering the overworld isn't even the main focus of the game. All this does is serve as an unneeded distraction from the meat of the game that I feel could have been easily avoided. Another aspect of the overworld that is arguably an unneeded distraction are the enemy challenges. Scattered across the map are various pagey characters who will offer you a single minigame to complete where you have to defeat every enemy in the course in order to advance to previously blocked off sections of the overworld. And I'm sorry, but was challenge really the right word to use here? These minigames are basically just minute platforming sections with a handful of enemies in each that really don't feel well developed enough on their own to be worth spending any significant amount of time on. I was able to complete each of these challenges on my first playthrough within maybe 2 minutes tops, and just found them all to be totally forgettable. They aren't really any different from the platforming sections you find in the main chapters, so they all just kind of feel like one big derivative excuse to give the player an extra hoop to jump through in the game. Once again, another unneeded distraction from the meat of the game. Speaking of distracting from the meat of the game, maybe it's time we finally talk about Yooka-Laylee in the Impossible Lair's main course, the levels, or chapters as it likes to call them. This is where Impossible Lair turns into a classic 2D side-scrolling platformer, and without a single doubt, this is where it truly shines. Impossible Lair hosts dozens of levels filled with a wide array of unique environments and platforming challenges that will challenge your platforming prowess in a seemingly endless amount of ways. You already know what it is with 2D platforming if you played Donkey Kong Country or Sonic the Hedgehog, so I don't need to explain to you how it works. But I can give you a list of the insane situations this game throws you into that you'll need to get yourself out of. You've got underwater sections, swinging sections, climbing sections, vine riding sections, floating platforms, giant fans, direction swinging conveyor belts, giant shifting saw blades, venomous spiders, giant crabs, spinning cannons, spike traps, secret areas, giant lasers that actively want to murder you, wind mechanics, slippery paths. Impossible Lair has it all and then some when it comes to its main chapters. Your primary moveset includes the obvious running and jumping, but you also get a neatly convenient mid-air spinning ability, which unconventionally acts less as a double jump for the player and more so as a temporary flotation device, making it easier to scale wider gaps as well as to give you more wiggle room to accurately stick a tight landing. On top of that, a very familiar move comes into play where you can spin while running. This spin attack will be used to take out smaller enemies and also create momentum that the player can use to pull off some longer jumps. If you've played obscene amounts of Donkey Kong Country like I have, then you already know just how adaptable to varying situations this move can be, and how truly satisfying it is to use. All these moves come together to create a gameplay ecosystem that encourages momentum above all else. The game wants you to play the same level over and over again. It wants you to get good through repetition, so that way when you become a pro at this, you'll be able to charge through each of these obstacle courses at a consistent but quick pace, making for an adrenaline-fueled experience that is just chef's kiss brilliant. What's more is every level has various side activities for you to do on top of making it to the end goalpost. This includes collecting quills from Ghost Riders and collecting all 5 Twit coins hidden around every level. And if that wasn't enough, you have the ability to alter each chapter in the overworld, creating an entirely new version of the level to explore, complete with a fresh set of collectibles to grab in each. While there may be a handful of these alternate levels that lazily feel like the exact same level but with just one minute detail changed in it, most of them are changed up enough in terms of their music, aesthetic, and overall atmosphere that it generally feels like 90% of them you're getting an entirely new level. Oh yeah, and can we talk about how legendary the soundtrack is in most of these levels? These two legends, Grant Kirkhope and David Wise, headed up the music composition for Impossible Lair, and well, here, look, let's just take a look, take a listen. It is undeniable what a high-quality experience Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair is in general. It's got plenty of well-developed content, plenty of collectibles to satisfy the completionists, and an overarching likability akin to classic duos like Banjo-Kazooie that this time around does not feel forced, but actually feels earned. I guess Play-tonic Games finally got what they wanted out of Yooka-Laylee, and who would have guessed that all it took was for the pairing to spend less time trying to relive the glory days of collectathons and more time carving their own path with an enjoyable, well-polished gaming experience. Now, if you've managed to stick with the video up to this point, but currently have your mouse floating above the dislike button because there hasn't been enough of that sweet, sweet negative bashing of games you love so much, well, this one's for you. Because I dabble in complaining about games myself, and Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair, believe it or not, is not immune to criticism. The biggest issue I take is arguably a personal one, but it's still an issue nonetheless. The Play-tonics, I find, to be quite useless. I am already the type of player who prefers to not use in-game modifiers unless they are specifically required for something. But even the ones I came across in Impossible Lair, those will be pretty worthless to any average player, methinks. The one Play-tonic I did find useful was the catchy tonic, which makes Laylee panic less and take more time to fly away after you've taken a hit. The rest are middling garbage in my eyes. You've got tonics that slow down time, tonics that add more checkpoints, the Super Buddy Slam, ones that give all enemies in the level googly eyes, ones that mess up the game's control scheme, and you've got horrible, crappy, horrible generic screen filters that hurt my eyes. It'd be one thing if you could actually see what you were doing with some of these filters, but most of the ones that I used just messed up the game's visuals so badly you could hardly tell what was going on, or they just gave me a massive headache. The game tries to incentivize you to use more tonics by making them either negatively or positively impact your quill multiplier in each level. Each level you start at a default 1.0 quill multiplier, meaning every quill you collect will be worth one single quill. If you use a tonic that makes the level more difficult in some way, such as the googly-eyed tonic that makes every enemy take one extra hit of damage to destroy, then your quill multiplier will go up. If you use one that makes the level easier, it will go down. Obviously, the higher your quill multiplier per level, the more quills you can collect in total. Quills act as this game's currency and can be used to purchase the tonics you collected in the Overworld or to unlock certain parts of the Overworld map. So, considering I already do not prefer to use them, and considering that most of them are crap, the Play-tonics as a whole are a complete afterthought, which is sad since they are such a big part of the game. All in all though, you can get by without using any of them, as they aren't a requirement, they are just somewhat helpful to certain people. And that's all I'm really gonna say on that matter. You do you, man. The last thing I want to address is Impossible Lair's overall difficulty curve. More specifically, how that difficulty curve ties into the final level, the literal Impossible Lair. Every chapter, starting from Chapter 1 all the way up to the Impossible Lair, feels like an overall smooth progression of difficulty. I'm not faulting that. What I will say is while the chapters do get mildly challenging by the time you reach the end of the game, they never become truly challenging. I definitely died numerous times throughout my first playthrough of the game, but very rarely did I ever actually find myself getting stuck on any one section of the chapters. The one time I did get remotely stuck was in Chapter 20, where you have to run away from a giant spiked cannonball during an auto-scrolling section while also dodging enemies put in front of you. Other than that, Impossible Lair really wasn't all that challenging to me. And that's fine, I have no issue with that. But it's the fact that this game had me going from a not super challenging series of levels to the Impossible Lair, where the platforming and accompanying boss fight is jarringly more challenging than anything else in the game. And I know, it's the name of the level, it's the Impossible Lair, but I really think this game would have benefited from a few more chapters that actually better prepared you for a difficulty spike of this magnitude. Because the very last level, the Impossible Lair, really does live up to its namesake. It's not easy, and the majority of players running through this for the first time probably died numerous times on their way to beating this whole game. You do have the added tool of using the battalion soldiers, who you free at the end of each of the game's chapters, allowing you to take extra hits from enemies and objects, and the game does do a good job of encouraging you to collect more of them, since the more you collect, the more hits you can take in the Impossible Lair, but I can't help but nitpick the noticeably steep change in difficulty when comparing the Impossible Lair to the chapter coming right before it. Chapter 20, Scareship Scroll, is the last chapter to complete before the Impossible Lair, and comparatively, it's a walk in the park. There is the previously mentioned auto-scrolling section that had me die quite a few times, but aside from that, it's a very doable level. And the alternate version of the same level is even easier. The only noteworthy thing about the alternate version of Chapter 20 is this section where you're standing on this blimp while enemies and objects come flying at you from off-screen. This is the final section of the last level of the game, and I was able to breeze through it on my first go. So to have the Impossible Lair immediately follow this underwhelming last chapter, you see the problem. Impossible Lair's overall difficulty curve never truly prepares you for the Impossible Lair. It starts from the bottom and smoothly trends upward to an overall mild level of challenge in Chapter 20, and then suddenly skyrockets straight up with the Impossible Lair. I just can't help but notice the obvious disconnect here. It honestly feels like I'm getting two different experiences when comparing the game's main chapters to the Impossible Lair. It feels like the Impossible Lair level is DLC made for the hardcore gamers, while the other 20 chapters are the main game meant for everybody else. Mic drop.